You're listening to The Abundance Agenda, a podcast about growth and progress. I'm James O'Malley.
And once again, I'm Martin Robbins.
This week we're talking about an infuriating battery farm, or lack of battery farm, in Kent. But first, Martin, let's talk about the Isle of Wight.
So James, France has Corsica, where I went on holiday recently in September. Lovely place, good food, good beaches. Next to that, Italy has Sardinia. Both of these are glittering destinations full of yachts and sun and sea and rugged landscapes and so on. Very popular with their countrymen. And of course, listeners will know that Britain has its own glistening summer paradise. Isn't that right, James?
Martin, I must admit, I'm struggling a bit. You've lost it. Where on earth could you be talking about?
So I'm talking, of course, about the Isle of Wight, the sort of yacht-infested lump of chalk that sits just off Portsmouth and Southampton on the other side of the Solent, which, by the way, used to be a river. This is where the Spanish Armada were going to set up their first base when they tried to invade in the 16th century, but they were denied by the royal fleet of our brave Queen Elizabeth I, although she wasn't actually on the ships at the time, of course. And that's one of many reasons, James, why we're not doing this podcast in Spanish. So a real pivotal point in British history.
Martin, if there's one thing I know about you, is that you're a man who likes his boats. So I'm terrified this is just going to turn into a long lecture about the history of the Royal Navy or something like this. Have you got a point here, or are we just talking about the Armada again?
I mean, that would be an amazing episode, but no, I'm getting there. So today, the Isle of Wight, it's a remarkably poor place, considering it's just off the coast of Hampshire. Like, it's right next to the cities of Southampton and Portsmouth. So on the one side of the Solent, you have big urban conurbations, you have roads, motorways, railways, world-class universities. You have, of course, the headquarters of the Royal Navy, the UK's second largest container port, and, of course, the massive throbbing economy of southeast England, the richest part of the UK. And it's literally as if life is passing the Isle of Wight by, because on the other side, you've got this small island with a terrible economy, no jobs, grinding poverty, some of the largest rates of child poverty in the UK, almost a third of children living in poverty. It's economically a disaster of a place.
Oh, that's weirdly upsetting, because I didn't realise that. I mean, I've got some quite fond memories of the Isle of Wight. When I was around 9, my parents took me there on holiday, and we went to this sort of, I suppose it's a theme park. Don't think Disneyland, but it's proto sort of Victorian theme park, which is called Black Gang Chine, which sounds like, 3 ethnic slurs rolled into one, but it's actually a real name of a real place, and it's all above board. Though I remember, there's some fiberglass dinosaurs there. There was an amazing attraction that was built into one of the hillsides there called Snakes and Ladders. And what it was like a snakes and ladders board, but with like steps that you'd go up as you'd spin a spinner that was on the wall, and you would go a number of steps, and there was ladders to climb up, and then there was like slides to slide down to represent the snake. So a really high concept and clever idea for a visitor's attraction. And the other interesting thing about Black Gang Chine, again, not a slur, is that it's actually falling into the sea. It's getting loads of like coastal erosion around there. So the park keeps having to move all of its attractions further inland.
Yes, when I was growing up, we lived near Portsmouth on the south coast. And so Meridian Tonight, or Coast to Coast, the local TV news program in the 80s and 90s, basically every sort of few weeks would have a feature on, the latest bit of Black Gang Chine that's fallen into the sea and how they've had to move all the dinosaurs around again. So it's certainly a place where things are happening, possibly not the right things. Of course, we visited the Isle of Wight together. I think it was on one of your birthdays, possibly your 30th.
Yeah, it was definitely quite a long time ago now. I remember we went to the dockyard, of course, because you were with us and wanted to see the boats. And we took a hovercraft across to the Isle of Wight. That was very exciting. I think it's like the last remaining hovercraft service in Britain. So that was cool.
Yeah, and I mean, this sort of epitomizes the problem with the Isle of Wight, which is that you need to take either a boat or some newfangled contraption like a hovercraft to get there. So you basically have this island full of people who can't get jobs. There are loads of jobs in Hampshire, but they just can't get to them. The only way that people can get to the mainland is on ferry services like Red Jet. And, they have to rely on them to commute to work, or if they want to get to larger hospitals for specialist things, or go to an airport, or basically go anywhere. But as you'll find, if you Google Red Jet, the service is not one of Britain's finest. There are a lot of complaints. It's chronically unreliable. Ferries break down. They're routinely cancelled. It's right up there with the worst train lines. At one point, apparently, ferries were running with only 3 of their 4 engines working because the operator said they couldn't find enough spare parts to fix them. So it sort of gives you an idea, these just decrepit ferries limping back and forth between the Isle of Wight and the mainland. It's dire. And of course, if your train breaks down, you can just get a bus or take a car or get a taxi in emergency or whatever. But if the ferry breaks down, you're completely stuffed, like you're stuck on the island or off the island. That's it.
Which would be worse? I don't know.
Yeah.
But so this is, it's weird, like a single point of failure for an entire tens of thousands of people, I guess. I think at one point it was the largest constituency in the UK because they didn't want to break it up. There's an interesting fact. But anyway, so this is a single point of failure, Martin. So is there anything that can be done about this?
So normally on this podcast, we rely on you, obviously, to come up with the harebrained schemes. But in this case, we have an idea already baked in, and it is called, James, the Freedom Tunnel.
So I'm already on board. I love a good tunnel. So I guess they want to build a tunnel under the Solent, but why not a bridge?
So a bridge would be a nice idea, but it would be a massive engineering challenge. So obviously, first of all, you've got container ships coming in and out of Southampton. You've got the Royal Navy coming out of Portsmouth, and these are massive ships. Now, James, I know that you're a notorious fan of Canada, right?
Yeah, I was famous for a week in Canada. That's a whole other story, which one day I will tell on this podcast.
Absolutely. So you'll be familiar with Niagara Falls, of course, down near sort of Toronto kind of area.
Surprisingly, not a classy place. You imagine this sort of beautiful waterfalls and everything being lovely and serene and naturey. No, it's a horrible tourist resort. There's literally a big casino and a Burger King that has a roller coaster on the roof, just within view of the falls.
Yeah, I'd say it's up there with sort of Bournemouth as a spectacle. In fact, I think I possibly prefer Bournemouth. It's okay. It was very hot when I went there, full of tourists, and mostly I just wanted to sit down and have a Coke Zero. But I mention it because Niagara Falls, James, is roughly 58 meters tall, and that is the same height, believe it or not, as a Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carrier from top to bottom.
Bloody hell.
Now, we're not nautical experts here again, and I don't want to get too deep into it, but obviously not all of that is above water. But the point is a bridge is going to be in the way of lots of shipping. It's going to be very difficult to get around that. And also the geology of the Solent would make it quite difficult to build a bridge. It's a little bit like, very often people talk about, could you build a bridge across the Straits of Gibraltar? And the answer is no, because actually it's really, really difficult to get any kind of structure across there. The Solent, which is now a sort of an inlet, used to be a river valley. So years ago, listeners who are following along this podcast on Google Maps, as many of you I know do every week, the River Frome that comes through sort of Somerset and Dorset and comes out just north of Swanage and off the end of Bournemouth Beach, used to actually connect all the way along the south coast to the Solent, and there was kind of a chalk ridge across that kind of kept it in place. That eroded. There was some kind of accident, water flooded in, and now, tragically, the Isle of Wight is no longer connected to the Swanage Peninsula, which is basically why we have all this problem in the first place. Anyway, it's very awkward. It's very difficult to get across. Honestly, you're better off just getting a tunnel boring machine, or TBM as experts like us call them, and just going underneath the whole thing, being done with it.
So that sounds plausible to my non-engineering brain, Martin, but where exactly would this tunnel go?
So the idea is it would start just west of Portsmouth, around Gosport. It would go under the Solent, of course. That's the whole point of a tunnel. And it would pop up pretty much in the middle of the kind of triangle that Cowes and Ryde and Newport form on the sort of northeast of the island. So for the vast majority of the island population, it would be very accessible. The idea is this would be a road tunnel, a bit like the Lower Thames crossing. And it would be pretty easy to link it up to the M27, which is the big motorway that goes between Portsmouth and Southampton. From there, you've got easy access to those cities. You can get to the M3, the A3M, up into London. You can get to Heathrow pretty easily, or at least if the M25 is not too bad. Southampton Airport, basically the world would be your oyster.
I'm slightly disappointed you're not pitching me a rail tunnel here, because I know the trains on the Isle of Wight, they're all old London Underground trains, so we know they can work underground, so why not just go a little bit further? But anyway, so the Isle of Wight is a poor place, the economy isn't great, not many people live there. Digging a tunnel, it sounds plausible, I guess, from an engineering perspective from what you're saying, but is there actually a business case here? Is it worth it in economic terms? Who's going to pay for this?
I mean, can you put a price on freedom, James? But just to give a sense of the economics, because this is always the thing that comes up. Oh, it's going to be really expensive. Currently, these unreliable ferry operators rake in about £110 million a year for what is apparently a fairly dismal level of service. Now, some serious surveys have been done. They've had engineering firms, tunneling firms come and take a quick look. That'll cost you, kind of thing. And they put the cost of the tunnel at around about £3 billion, give or take. The idea would obviously be to make this a toll road, so you'd pay a certain amount to go back and forth. And advocates for the tunnel, there's a whole campaign group pushing for it. They reckon it could generate about £200 million a year of income, which is a fairly conservative estimate. Obviously, you've got operating costs, ongoing maintenance that's going to eat into that a bit. But in theory, there's no reason why it couldn't pay for itself in, say, 15, 20 years.
And when you've got all these tourists coming across the Solent to go to Blackgang Chine, which will have been expanded to be like Disney World because you've got all these extra tourists, then think of the taxes there. Surely that makes sense. But I don't know. I guess, Martin, £3 billion, though, it is still a lot of money to find, especially at the moment. Rachel Reeves, I imagine, probably isn't at the top of her list of things to spend money on at the moment. So is anyone really ever going to invest that much money in the Isle of Wight?
I think this is where you sort of have to look for solutions beyond the government. So I think it's fair to say, I don't want to disparage Keir Starmer or Rachel Reeves. I don't think they've got a big folder on the desk of number 10 or number 11 with plans to save the Isle of Wight on the front of it. I'm not sure that it's a massive national priority at the moment. But the best thing is we actually already have a model of how to do this and how to fund it very nearby in the Faroe Islands. So on the Faroe Islands, there are only 54,000 people. And that compares to 140,000 on the Isle of Wight. So Isle of Wight population is 2 or 3 times the size. And not only that, but as we've mentioned, the Isle of Wight is right next to major cities, major shipping ports, major transport connections and the mainland. Faroe Islands, again, not to disparage any listeners from the Faroe Islands, but you're pretty much in the middle of nowhere. So, it's a more challenging thing to get investment for, and yet they were able to do that. They were basically able to fund a vast network of something like 20-odd road tunnels between the various islands, basically by borrowing the money from the bank and repaying it with toll roads. So I think if it's clearly financially viable for an isolated population of 50,000 people, it's really hard to imagine why you couldn't do the same for an island of 140,000 that's right off the south coast.
Honestly, Martin, I know this sounds crazy, but I sort of went into this thinking, oh, here we go. We'll have a sort of fun segment about digging a tunnel to the Isle of Wight because our audience are the sort of people who like looking at maps and imagining railway lines going between things and that sort of thing. We love crayons on a map sort of thing. But this is all a bit of fun. Nobody's taking this seriously. But now I think I'm sold. Why aren't we doing this? This is crazy. This seems like an obvious idea if it makes that much sense.
Objectively, it's a brilliant idea. And I also think it would be a brilliant idea to have an episode where we just look at a map and draw fun imaginary tunnels on it. I think that would be an excellent Christmas special. As ever, you have the usual sort of array of the kind of Cheems mindset excuses. So, it's too expensive. It's too difficult, blah, 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 blah. The biggest problem, James, and the reason why it's unlikely to happen and actually previous efforts have failed, is that it turns out that one man's prison is another man's castle. And so while lots of islanders would prefer to just kind of be able to move around and have freedom and not live in grinding poverty, there is a vocal group of people who are militantly opposed to any kind of fixed link to the evil mainland. They're basically like the equivalent of the anti-HS2 people in Buckinghamshire, for example, really kind of full on against it.
But they're not even like that, Martin, because unlike the anti-HS2 people in Buckinghamshire, people in the Isle of Wight, they would benefit from the tunnel. It's not like the railway line just going near them. It's not like the tunnel is going somewhere else to join up to other places. They would literally benefit directly.
Exactly. And yet they're so vocal that it actually led to an earlier railway link about 2 decades ago being completely abandoned as a concept. So to give you a sense of the flavour, the kind of tone of the opposition, I'll give you a couple of quotes from it. There was one woman interviewed by the Daily Echo a few years ago who said that the tunnel would destroy the Isle of Wight's plans to become a self-sufficient and carbon-neutral eco-island, which is the kind of statement I think we could do a whole other episode on, to be honest.
It reminds me of the North Korean, was it Juche ideology, where it's all like self-sufficiency, something like that. But how the hell are we talking about self-sufficiently? The Isle of Wight it's inherently dependent on everywhere else. It's a tiny island. You can't get microchips on the Isle of Wight. They don't grow or manufacture them there.
Yeah, I mean, the Isle of Wight is about as self-sufficient as my wine fridge. I mean, it's, it's sunny. Apparently, they grow a lot of asparagus. They're famous for that on the Isle of Wight. Heritage tomatoes. But if you want anything other than a tomato and asparagus salad, you're pretty stuffed. There's barely any crops. I don't think you get more than a few loaves of bread from the whole island. It's madness. So again, we have this kind of I guess, green fantasy of a place where everyone's sort of okay with being poor. But my favourite quote comes from a man who was speaking to a Vice reporter several years ago. Do you remember Vice, James? Older magazine?
Yeah, but talking about the Isle of Wight, it seems a little bit unambitious of Vice. Shouldn't it be someone like taking ketamine with the Taliban or something? That's more Vice's sort of vibe.
No, I think this was in their era where they tried to do more quaint journalism, and before I don't even know what happens to them now. Did they fold? It's a topic for another time. But one of their reporters interviewed a chap who said, and I'll try and do the Isle of Wight accent justice, "The island is a castle, and the Solent is the moat that protects us. Once you let down the drawbridge, the castle falls."
Where is the Isle of Wight? It felt like a Scottish island, but then turned into like Winston Churchill.
It's somewhere to the south and west, James. That's all I really know. But I mean, this is someone who basically thinks the Isle of Wight is, I don't know, King's Landing or something, and that people from the mainland are basically White Walkers.
I'll be honest, Martin, I don't understand that reference. I'm not quite clever enough for HBO, but it does make me think of the community in 28 years later, the recent film, where there was this little sort of medieval pre-industrial community on a tiny island, scared of going to the mainland because of all of the zombies.
Yeah, I mean, essentially that. And I mean, if anything, I guess the question should be, do the English actually want to deal with these people being able to come over on a regular basis? But in any case, unlikely to happen any soon because, with the islands so divided and so much strong opposition, the only way to resolve the issue politically would be a referendum. It was floated by a Conservative MP some years ago, but they weren't particularly keen. Obviously, other referendums have happened since then and have not turned out well for really anybody involved. So no sane politician wants to do a referendum on such a divisive topic again. And here we are. We have this prime piece of sunny southern England real estate that's just sort of limping on in poverty.
I love these positive stories that you bring to the pod, Martin.
I try my best, James.
So, Martin, it's a shorter show than usual this week because to pull back the curtain a little bit, I'm on holiday. This show is going out a week after we've recorded it, so anything could have happened in the interim.
Yeah, James. I mean, I don't even know what's on my Substack this week. We don't even know if there'll actually even be a Substack. It's very hard to predict these things.
If we've learned anything about politics and the news in recent years, it's that who knows what's going to happen. So, yeah, hopefully people will be hearing this and it won't be from the sort of a nuclear bunker somewhere. But anyway, if you want to have a look on our Substacks, maybe there's something there. Maybe there's not. Who knows? I've got a couple of guest posts scheduled. So hopefully there'll be some stuff ticking over on there. But you can find links to our Substacks on abundancepod.com. And don't forget, if you're enjoying the show, to tell people about it. Go to WhatsApp now, send a link to all your friends, post it on social media, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts so we keep making the show. But now, let's get to our guest. So this week, we're talking to the very, very cool Ed Jennings, who is the author and founder and editor of 2 amazing local newsletters, Local Authority, which is a Medway-based newsletter in Kent, and Kent Current, which covers the entire county of Kent. And Martin, you wanted to get Ed in to talk about this absolutely infuriating story about a battery farm, which, would you believe, is being NIMBY'd to death. So yeah, here's our chat with Ed, where we talk about that and also the broader Kent political picture with Reform in charge and how abundancy they are. So we're delighted to be joined now by the founder and editor of Kent Current, my favourite local journalism outlet, Ed Jennings. Thank you for joining us, Ed. And we wanted to talk to you on the show this week because of an absolutely infuriating story. I think everyone who must have read it in your newsletter, certainly if you're abundance-pilled like we are, would have been absolutely raging. It's about a battery storage farm that's proven controversial in North Kent. So can you give us the gist? Why is this so enraging? What's happened here?
So it's one of those stories where a green energy company called Clearstone Energy proposed putting together a battery energy storage solution near Dartford in Kent. This would have been a £200 million development, providing 300 megawatts of energy, which I know doesn't sound very much in its own right, but it's enough to basically power the 3 neighbouring towns for an hour. And that's one small storage location. This is not a big storage location, ultimately. It's a tiny slip of land. And it reached this weird point where, as is often the case, particularly in Kent politics, planning officers at Dartford Borough Council proposed refusing permission to build the storage in the first place.
And it's particularly annoying because of where it is and stuff. So I know the area a little bit. I'm not a million miles away from this battery storage place. And I think one of the complaints was, and you mentioned it in your piece about it, was one of the criticisms was this was going to harm the, quote, rural character of the area. So can you tell us about the Garden of England and the rural character of where this battery farm was going to be imposed?
Right. Well, so this beautiful rural area was directly south to the A2, one of the main transport corridors through Kent, which, for those not familiar, is an 8-lane dual carriageway. This is not some minor country lane. Immediately north of the site is also the high-speed one rail link connecting Ebbsfleet to Ashford and the wider continent. To the south of it is another railway line. To the east of it is and this is where it does start to get really important, a garden centre car park and a local council dump. So these are the things surrounding this beautiful patch of untarnished countryside that Dartford Borough Council was so eager to protect.
So what's actually happened? So the company have put in and said they want to build the battery storage there. Dartford Borough Council, they've not officially said no, I guess, but the thing was withdrawn because it looked like the votes were going to go against approving this project. So is that it? Are we not going to get any battery storage?
At this point, it's hard to know. So the official position is that the application has been withdrawn at the moment because Clearstone Energy very much saw the way the wind was blowing on this. And once the planning officers decided that they were going to recommend refusal, there was pretty much no chance councillors were going to go against the officers' recommendations. Councillors will often go against officers' recommendations to turn something down, but never to actually approve something. So yeah, once the writing was kind of on the wall for the application, they withdrew it. I imagine they probably will try and return again with a new version of the application in the future, but there's no way to know that at the moment.
And what's the kind of consequence of that for Kent, right? So essentially companies are trying to come to the county, they're trying to build things there. That's obviously going to help the local energy grid, but it's also jobs, it's construction, it's workforce and so on. Like, are these projects becoming more and more difficult in Kent, and what is the sort of potential impact of that?
Yeah, this is just kind of the latest in sort of a line of these kind of developments. We've had multiple solar farms across Kent rejected on very similar grounds to protect the rural character, often of which is not particularly rural sites. Often they can be what would be described as in this case, as what are now grey belt sites. So, peripherally on the fringe of the green belt, but not actually serving any green purpose. And so, yeah, we're seeing solar farms. I mean, we had a baffling example a few months ago where a green-led council in Kent fought to turn down a solar farm in Kent. So Kent is very big at talking the big game about switching to green energy, but they are not seemingly particularly eager if it actually means building anything to provide the green energy.
And how do they kind of justify that? So if you're a green councillor, you're turning down this project, which is pretty much vital if you want to have renewable energy. You need solar farms and you need batteries because you need to be able to store it and redistribute it and have energy when the sun isn't shining. So, I mean, do these councillors ever sort of give any explanation specifically about how this fits in with their wider aims?
It's one of those things where there's never really a coherent view on this. You will find every development will have its own very specialised reasons of why they don't want it. So in this particular case, there was an argument, for example, that the field was providing oxygen. So that's fantastic. Even though this is a very small patch of land, it's not publicly accessible. You can't actually go there and have enjoy this oxygen that it's generating. And more bafflingly in the officer's explanation was that it would cause an unnaturally flat development on the land. So flattening the countryside would look particularly unnatural, and therefore that would not be acceptable for the rural character. Now, this does vary across different areas. The green-led example from earlier, they were much more about just we can't build on agricultural land, which, is an argument, but also it's an argument we seem to use for every single bit of green energy infrastructure that comes along. So it's really hard to justify how you can ever get green energy built. If you can look at a plot of land like this and this isn't the place, where is?
So it's sort of reminiscent of places like Lincolnshire or Northumbria, where we've covered similar stories, right, of particularly solar farms, wind farms. They're in development. Councils have often declared a climate emergency, and these proposals come forward and they reject them. They're unable to make any progress. And at some point, it's like, well, what was the point of declaring a climate emergency in the first place? You may as well be climate skeptics or something if you're going to do this, which provides a neat segue into my next question, which is that in a number of these places, those councillors have been swept aside by the reform juggernaut, as I think we're legally obliged to call it. This has obviously happened local to you. So how much of a vibe shift does that kind of cause there?
Well, the good news is that in Kent, we no longer have a climate emergency because since Reform swept power in the May local elections, among deciding on basically flag policy for County Hall, the only other thing they've meaningfully done at the council is to rescind the climate emergency in Kent. So thankfully, we don't need green energy because there is no climate emergency in Kent. So really, Dartford Borough Council are just getting on board with where we are as a county.
So what is this like? Give us a sense of like the Reform have taken over the council. As you say, they seem to be spending a lot of the time fiddling with flags and making undeclarations of things. How are they governing in general? Are they actually doing substantial things, or is a lot of this kind of TikTok stuff for show, effectively?
Yeah, at the moment, there's been very little example of actual governing in Kent. What has happened has pretty much just been a continuation of the Conservative administration's policies from before May. Literally, the only new things Reform will seemingly come up with is rescinding the climate emergency and seemingly cutting a few bits from the budget, but nothing substantial. So hence why they're now panicking about having to increase council tax next year, because there is no real meaningful savings to be found in local government. They've swept into power on this promise that we are going to, save hundreds of millions of council waste, and discovered that doesn't really exist in the first place. So now they're seemingly begging the opposition for suggestions of what they can actually do to cut money from the council.
So, Ed, one of the reasons it's important what you're doing is you're at the front lines of watching Reform when they're actually doing stuff in Kent. But in addition to Kent Current, you're also the brains behind Local Authority, which is a Medway-specific newsletter. Medway is in Kent, but it's also not in Kent. It's a unitary authority that declared its independence a little while ago. So it's a strange place by my standards. But the reason I want to mention it is because you published an amazing interview with a Medway-based Reform councillor not so long ago, where I think he said he didn't read books. And the only policy view I got a sense of was that he doesn't want new housing. So is Kent screwed in terms of abundance-aligned topics? We care about housing and energy. Should we just be preparing for endlessly depressing news for the next 5 years or something like that?
It's one of those slightly odd things, because if you actually look at like the National Reform Party policy, they're actually very enthusiastic about building housing, and accept there is a housing crisis and we do need to get on and build. The problem is, much like, I guess it's a similar situation amongst Labour, the Greens, and maybe some others, that the second you actually come to building new houses on their local patch, then it kind of all changes very rapidly. And there's always, again, a very good reason why not to build in their patch, but you should definitely go build in the other patch. I'm not quite as pessimistic about the state of Kent as you've maybe made it sound there in the question, James, which is slightly surprising given how many of these council meetings I'm sitting in and hearing these Reform councillors. I think mostly because I don't believe many of them are actually doing anything. Most of the day-to-day work is all still done by council officers. That hasn't really changed.
It's the Kent deep state.
Your words, not mine, James. It's just that thing. It's that kind of like, councillors don't really do that much. They are there ultimately to guide policy rather than to actually do things. And yes, obviously there is like a perception, and there is an element of things they can control. But in terms of, say, building in Kent, not much has really changed since May. I mean, everything was effectively being NIMBY'd under the Tories just as much as it's now being NIMBY'd under Reform. So from our point of view, not much has changed, really.
Yeah, one of the things that we're seeing with a number of topics that we cover is, as you say, different parties come in, but the amount of change is not necessarily as much as you would think. Even when radical parties are coming in, say the Greens or say Reform, actually they seem to sort of come up against reality and the real world and the limitations of their power. And often behind the scenes, even though the vibes are very different, actually the same sort of NIMBYism or the same kind of concerns and things come into play. So, I mean, is it just the case that really whoever comes into power, actually the county kind of continues on and the impact is quite limited? Is there basically a limit to what Reform could do in Kent?
Yeah, so fundamentally it does sort of feel that way. We're now 6 months into Reform administration, and again, this could very much come back and haunt me a few years from now, but at the moment, things don't feel dramatically different. Most day-to-day functions of the council have kind of continued on. I mean, officers at the council that I've spoken to said that not much has changed on their day-to-day, other than maybe there's a slightly different level of communication from councils involved. And I think that's the biggest part of the problem. When radical parties come in, it's often that you've got inexperienced councillors coming into the role, so they don't really know what they can and can't do anyway. So nearly everything they're sort of doing at that point is then guided by officers. And officers, as we know, are very much, they would rather keep kind of the status quo of the council kind of to moving on smoothly.
I thought it was really striking, Ed. A few weeks ago on Kate Current, you wrote about how you went down to Ashford for an event that the council were running, the Reform-led council were running, to try and basically raise attention about cross-channel rail services, something we've talked about on our show repeatedly, not least because I'm very self-interested in it because I live in Kent as well, and restarting services from Ashford and Ebbsfleet. And it seems almost like that was like normal politics. You had the Kent county council person there, you had like Labour MPs there, and you had all the sort of, I guess, civil society Kent types there. So it does seem like normal council things are happening anyway.
Yeah, I think when it comes to particularly an issue like the international rail services, where it's probably the only issue in Kent pretty much everyone agrees on, you will struggle to find anyone in Kent who doesn't want trains back at Ebbsfleet and Ashford. And that extends from Reform to Labour to the Lib Dems to Tories to anyone, basically. So in that context, yes, you can get everyone in the room and have a nice, sometimes literal song and dance about bringing trains back to Kent.
I'm sorry, I'd love to see this song and dance show. Where can we, is there video of this? Like, where do we find the singing and dancing?
I mean, I do have about a minute of it, and there was literally singing and dancing. It was utterly horrifying.
Wow.
But no, so the problem is it doesn't necessarily work that way for every issue. We've got this agreement on international rail. I would say communication between councils in Kent feels a lot more strained now than it did previously. We're regularly seeing weird disputes between certainly Medway and Kent County Council now, just on, I think it is this thing again of inexperienced councillors and just business not being done in the way things used to be done previously. So you've now got there's a situation in the last week where 2 Kent tourism bodies collapsed. Kent County Council, Medway Council agreed to get them up and running again. One day before the agreement was signed, Kent County Council got in touch with Medway Council and were like, no, you now need to give us double the amount of money to get this off the ground than we originally agreed. And it's not that necessarily that amount of money is wrong. It's the fact of just they're not doing things by the sort of agreed standard. It's the last minute changes and just kind of from Medway's point of view, Kent are an increasingly unreliable partner, at least when it comes to politics. But yes, I don't think that really changes much on the day-to-day function of the council.
So Ed, you set up local authority to basically improve news reporting and by extension local democracy in Kent. I think part of that was based on your sort of previous frustrations, I guess, with politics in Kent. It's doing very well. It's winning awards year after year to the point where it must be quite boring at this stage, just kind of winning everything all the time. But, well done. And now that you are the sort of the Stephen Hendry of local political reporting, what do you... what? I do love to get a snooker reference in.
That was I was expecting, sorry.
But now that it's been very successful, it's a model we've seen other parts of the UK follow. Why do you think it's so difficult for mainstream media to cover local politics as well? If I look at, say, the BBC's local democracy service, I would say nowhere near the same standard, however much they're kind of putting into it, which is a lot of money. And again, on my own Substack, when I've been looking for stories in the local area, there's this incredible sort of rich seam of mad stuff going on almost everywhere that you can dig into and mine and find incredible stories. Why do you think you've been able to do it, but perhaps more traditional outlets haven't?
I mean, it's a very good question. I think on the most part, there's an element of resources, and we certainly don't have resources, but also we're seemingly willing to sit in council meetings for hours at our own expense to get this job done. And newspapers aren't necessarily willing to send a journalist to a council meeting for, say, 5-6 hours in the hope that a small story might come out of it. Whereas we feel it's just important someone is sitting in the room for each of those meetings, regardless of whether or not anything comes out of it. Now, that might be, I mean, from our point of view, good journalism, but it's also ultimately a terrible business model. So I see why other people don't necessarily want to go down that path. The local democracy reporting service, that's a slightly more complicated question. I think they are doing good work with what they've got, but also it is still relatively limited. We've got ultimately 3 local democracy reporters in Kent. We've got one covering Medway, one covering Kent County Council, and then another one who has to cover all 13 districts in Kent at once. Now, So that means ultimately, like Kent County Council and Medway Council do get reasonable coverage, but you're not getting much in the way of coverage of what's happening at, say, Thanet District Council, or what's happening down in Sevenoaks or Ashford. And that's kind of the gap in the coverage. And that's something we wrestle with as well, because we're ultimately a two-person operation, and covering, effectively 13, 14 councils is slightly beyond our time and resources, unfortunately.
So Ed, you're doing amazing work. I do recommend everyone listening, go now, subscribe to Kent Current, subscribe to local authority. Even if you don't live in Kent, if you're interested in what Reform are doing when they're actually trying to govern somewhere, trying to actually run somewhere, support Ed and his colleague Steve and their amazing work. We'll put links to all of that on abundancepod.com. But for now, Ed Jennings, thank you very much. And Martin, that's just about it for this week's show. How do you think it's gone?
Pretty decently, James. It's always a good podcast when we have someone like Ed Jennings on. I have to say, a huge fan of his. So an absolute delight to get him onto the show. And I should tell people, James, about our special offer this week. For every new subscriber, we will unseat one Reform councillor in Kent. That is something that will definitely happen for every subscriber that we add. And I'm sure it will make Ed very happy to hear this as well.
I live in Kent, so please, listeners, subscribe. I want a better council. Abundancepod.com, listen to the back catalogue, follow links to our Substacks where there may or may not be content. But for now, thanks for listening.
See you next week.